going to cover way too much material. So I encourage you to take the notes and read them, enjoy them, because I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm only going to cover highlights that are more important, because there's some really cool history in here, which does play into everything we're talking about. But I'm going to try to keep as much of the focus on what's going on with the churches and development of different structures, etc. Though I have to go through and sort of develop a little bit of the historical framework. So today we're going to be talking about, it's referred to often by historians as the church in the desert, which is the development and the continuation of the Protestant churches that are the Huguenots in France. And then we're also going to talk about the Puritans a little bit. Not all the details, but just enough to give you a hint for where they are, where they fit in, and some of the developments, because some of the things that we see from the Puritans, of course, follow on, because a lot of those people ended up coming here to the United States. So we're going to look at all those different aspects. So we're going to start with France, then we're going to turn our attention to England. And we're going to be moving from as early as the middle of the 16th century or 1500s all the way to the early 1700s or 18th century. So we're going to be covering a lot of stuff, so I'll try to resync the time as we wander through. So first off, in France, we've already mentioned this about Henry IV of France. He was the guy who was the Protestant who became Catholic but acted as a Protestant, and some of the Catholics didn't like it, and so in 1610 he is assassinated by a zealous Catholic monk. He was very gracious king, if that makes any sense, especially during this time. Some of the things we look at today and we go, that seemed pretty harsh. Well, to them it was pretty nice. So he was actually referred to as Henry the Great, and they're Henry the Grand, and he was a very good leader, and he was very tolerant in religious affiliation. The people liked him, both Protestants and Catholics, because he was kind of like, okay, well, the king's not taking sides here. He's trying to be fair about it, even though he claims to be Catholic and helps the Protestants. So, of course, what's going to happen? There's going to be people on either side who don't like that he's Protestant helping Catholics or Catholics helping Protestants or whatever. So you can't please everybody. But overall, the guy was a good guy. He helped with law, economics, education, exploration. So he was a good guy. And when he gets assassinated in 1610, people aren't real happy about it. And they're kind of like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? Well, enter the next in the series of child kings, Louis the 13th. Not Louis the 14th. We're going to talk about him today, but Louis the 13th. And Louis the 13th becomes king when he's 8. All right? And so his mother, Marie de Medici, not Catherine de Medici, of the previous Medicis. If you notice, the Medici family has a great deal of influence in France as well as Italy. But Marie de Medici, she helps out and sort of acts as the overseer for a while. And she kind of maintains the same type of attitude of the Edict of Nantes, or Nantes, or however it's actually pronounced, I don't know. But basic tolerance. Okay, here's the things you can do, Protestants. Here's the things you can do, Catholics. Even though Louis the 13th was more and more aligning himself with more and more staunch Catholics. So he's moving into, this is the early 17th century. And he starts turning when he gets in power, when he turns of age. He begins to turn pro-Habsburg, pro-Spanish, and exiles his mom. She's exiled basically in a palace, but she's still exiled. She's not part of the court, so she's not ruling anymore. She's not there. So this guy really believes in the divine right of kings. And he ends up with a gentleman, which we've mentioned before, Cardinal Richelieu. And Richelieu is of the same Cardinal Richelieu of the Three Musketeers fame. It's the same guy, same time period, because, D'Artagnan and all those guys. Well, this is Richelieu. This is the guy that's in that book. They play him kind of interesting in the book, but he is a power politician. And I'm not going to go into really much detail about Richelieu. I'm going to talk a little bit about him, but he is a very important figure. He starts as a bishop, and in 1622 he becomes a cardinal. And by 1624, he basically becomes the king's most trusted advisor. And many historians look at him and say he's effectively the first what we would refer to as a prime minister. Because prime ministers are typically under, there's a king with a prime minister type of thing. He basically runs the government. He starts off sort of as Secretary of State in our modern language, when he is a bishop, and becomes as a cardinal, and then he eventually becomes basically a prime minister. And this guy is really the guy who takes France as a developing nation state and turns it into an imperial nation state. He believes in the divine right of kings. His objectives in almost everything he does is for power for the king. Now it's interesting. He's a Catholic cardinal. But his first objective and his first loyalty is the power to the king. Now, if you're a Catholic in a country that's bouncing back and forth between Catholic and Protestant, you would think, well, hey, he's a bishop, he has power, he wants to maintain power for the Catholics. Richelieu didn't really care. Richelieu is a guy who said, yeah, I kind of, Catholic, and I'm not real crazy about the Huguenot people, the Protestants, but I'm going to maintain power for the king. So anybody who is against the king is his target, all right? So it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant, anybody who is against the king. So he starts off going against the nobility, and he takes away the office of the Constable of France, and who was the effective commander-in-chief of the French army whenever it was put together. He forced the nobles to have their fortified castles destroyed, so there wasn't any place they could go retreat to and sort of act as rebellions or rebels. And basically what this does is by taking this office away and taking these fortifications away, that gets rid of the nobility's major opposition to the king. If you notice, he didn't care whether you're Catholic or Protestant. Well, that left the other group that has power, militarily, castles, fortified cities, and that happens to be the Huguenots, who happen to be Protestant. All right, so he's an equal opportunity destroyer. And so suddenly people go, oh, well, he went after the Huguenots. Well, he went after the Huguenots not because they were Protestant. He went after the Huguenots because they were a threat to the king. All right, so if you notice here, Richelieu is the guy who is shifting everything away from church-state type of ideas or religious factions. He's the guy who turns it to, it's about the state. And yet he's a Catholic cardinal. Now, isn't that interesting? Reason is guess what? He is a guy who says, well, the Pope used to have that power, and if the Pope did have that power, I'd be supporting him. He doesn't have that power anymore. Remember, we've gone through the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, now we're moving into the 17th century. And so things have changed. All those things we've talked about before are changing, and he recognizes that change. So he's a Catholic cardinal who is really a politician. And he's a very effective politician. Part of the reason he goes against the Huguenots, though, eventually, and this is in 1627, he actually personally leads the French army in the siege of the stronghold of La Rochelle. I think that's how it's pronounced. And by 1629, he gains the upper hand, forces the leaders to submit to the peace of Allies. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced. But this basically confirms some of the things of the Treaty of Nantes, but it adds some additional things, that the Huguenots could no longer have political rights, and they also were required to demand that all of their cities and all of their fortresses had to be relinquished. And so a lot of those strongholds were destroyed. This, of course, just takes the Huguenots' power down. So Richelieu goes, okay, your guys are fine, because they no longer have power. The Huguenots had been being supported by, Spain and England. Well, who's an enemy of France? Now, what we end up next is the guy goes, hey, I'd rather have a peaceful country than political strife, because we've noticed all this politics and all this fighting, and Huguenots against the Catholics, and the Guise against the Bourbons and all these other guys. We remember this is just recent history, and everybody's going, we don't want any more of that. Richelieu says we don't want any more of that. So he is a guy who now engages France, though, in the 30 Years' War, but he doesn't do it for religious reasons. Even though religion is all, we always talk about all these wars in Europe were about religion because people build them up about religion. They had very little to do with religion. They had to do with a fight of who is in charge, power politics. All right? So a lot of times people look at this and say, this is about religion. Well, there's religious issues going on, and we're going to see some of the religious issues that develop. But most of these fighting, these wars, is about politics, economics, about who's on whose side, which royal house was married to somebody else. So he's the guy who is credited actually turning the 30 Years' War, and I'm not going to go into any much detail of that because we've already talked about it, into a political. And it basically becomes the non-Habsburgs, all the European powers, against the Habsburgs. And if you remember, the Habsburg Empire, and that was, Philip of Spain and the guys in Austria and what we call the Netherlands, the Belgium, Luxembourg, northern Italy. So they surrounded France and Germany, Holy Roman Empire. That was basically the Habsburgs. And you got France and England and Sweden and some other people and some of the Italian states against them. All right? So this is basically what the 30 Years' War gets turned into. And that's why Richelieu gets France involved in it. Because if the Habsburg dynasty wins, guess who loses? France does. Well, you can already see Richelieu is saying it's about the king, it's about the power, it's about the state. He's not really too concerned about whether you're Catholic or Protestant. He dies in 1642 at the age of 57. Okay? So if you notice a lot of these leaders, you had to do your stuff early because you didn't live that long. So now we get to the rise of Louis XIV, often referred to as the Sun King. Louis XIV becomes king because in 1643, Louis XIII dies. That's a year after Richelieu in 1642. He's 5. All right, he's a 5-year-old who becomes king of France. And he is left with sort of the guardianship of a guy named Cardinal Jules Mazarin. And he was one of Richelieu's strongest supporters. So he basically, they sort of hereditarily kind of said, Richelieu's the cardinal, okay, here's the next cardinal, and he's the next Secretary of State or Prime Minister, and he'll take care of what's going on with this young Louis XIV. He continues that peace and toleration that Richelieu had set up and that others had set up for a while. The Protestants avoided political intrigues and saw their numbers grow. So in other words, they just said, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and they just continued to develop and grow and teach. Now, Mazarin dies in 1661, though, and Louis refuses to name his successor. So he takes on all power. And this is where you see the idea of imperial France. The kings of France said, I am absolutely in charge of everything. Matter of fact, God put me here. I am not accountable to anything or anybody. You were going to see that the English kings try this and fail because Parliament has way more power. In France, they succeed, or the kings succeed and become basic, complete dictators. Now, what do you think a guy like Louis XIV is going to think about anybody or anything for any reason that stands against him?
He doesn't like it.
Yeah, he doesn't like it. So it doesn't matter who you are, what group you back, no matter what it is, he's going to be in charge. And this is what we're going to see. But Louis was a good king from a general perspective. He actually is the longest documented ruling monarch in European history. 72 years. Okay, 16... He died a long time, 1715. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he was 77. Yeah. He was an old guy. For that time, definitely. Now, he did a lot of good stuff while he was king. So I want to make sure you understand the guy isn't just all crazy. He actually did care about his country. But he cared about it from a dictatorial perspective, you know. It's all good. Now, if you disagree with me, you're dead. It's all good. If you disagree with me, you're dead kind of a guy. He's kind of like, you're for me or you're against me, and they're not too much in between. But he reduced the national debt through better taxation. He bolstered French commerce. He invited manufacturers and artisans across Europe to decrease French exports and increase French income based on the manufacturing and artistry that they could generate there. He created a modern army, reorganized it, made it professional. So now it's the King's Army, national army that's very well trained. He recodified and put French law together. Basically, it was kind of a hodgepodge of, okay, this law applies here but doesn't apply here. It was sort of regional law. He set up basically a national law. And his legal code actually was a model for early or more modern legal codes for national codes. So he did a lot of good stuff there. One of his bad things is he basically legalized in 1686, read my notes, 1685, sanctioning slavery. Because remember, this is where you start getting the European trade around the world, and then you get plantations and all this other kind of stuff. And in Africa, Africans were willing to sell other Africans for slaves, and he went, oh, well, okay, let's legalize that. Now, it was more humane because you couldn't break up families, and only Catholics could own slaves, and they had to be baptized. I mean, slavery's bad, but at least his form of it was a little better form of bad, if that makes any sense. But that was one of those problems that he instituted that in France. You also see a lot of the classical literature develop, French colonies in the Americas, Asia, Africa. La Salle, if you remember studying La Salle, he's the guy who claimed the Mississippi Basin, or what will eventually be referred to as the Louisiana Purchase because of King Louis. Eventually, that's the land that the United States under Jefferson, remember, purchased Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte of France. Well, Louis XIV is the guy who sent La Salle out, who claimed it for France, and also the stuff in North America, up in Quebec and places like that. So this is where the French expansion was going under Louis XIV. Now, from a religious perspective, he supported what is referred to as Gallicanism. Now, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, basically Gaul or France. Basically, it's we're first. It's France first, not to the exclusion of the Catholic Church, because Louis was Catholic leaning. He was not Protestant. He didn't actually care for the Protestants too much. But he said, all right, Pope, you're fine in matters of church, as long as I still control everybody in my country, which includes anybody in the church, which effectively puts the bishops under his control, at least in the limited form. So you can't do certain things anymore in France. We're not going to pay any attention to them. Now, a lot of people, if you noticed all these wars that have been going on, people are becoming more and more and more interested in the secular state. We've talked about that. Well, Louis takes advantage of it. And some of the things that he does is this is the Declaration of the Clergy of France of 1682. Some of these principles. The popes and the church itself has dominion from God over only things spiritual, not things temporal or civil. Therefore, kings and sovereigns are not beholden to the church in deciding temporal things. The church cannot depose them, nor can the church absolve the sovereign subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Remember, these were all the things that were going on in the Middle Ages. The popes were basically able to overrule and place the country under interdict and, say, hey, this guy's not legitimate. He doesn't have the right. And so you can rebel against him and all those different things. Well, Louis says, no, can't do that. But the church also must be in order with previous councils, traditions established throughout history. So again, that's that traditional church tradition has to follow. And again, that kind of puts you at odds against the Protestants. And the Pope was the chief parts of question of faith, but his judgment is not infallible and can be overruled by the church. So he's declaring the Pope is not infallible. It's funny, he has the divine right of kings and has absolute power and sovereignty and is infallible as king. But he says, but Pope, you're not infallible in the church, which is kind of interesting. So if you notice here, we're watching this walk of state power and secular power, but not gotten rid of the church yet. All right? Definitely Catholic leaning, because Louis was Catholic leaning. Now, he doesn't like the Protestants, and he doesn't like that Edict of Nantes because it reminds him of their political power of an outside group, the Huguenots. So Louis goes, I think social stability should be maintained through me. And after the 30 Years' War, those Huguenots are nothing but trouble anyway. So he decides he is going to get rid of this edict, but he's going to do it in a very clever way. See, if you don't force people to do stuff, you just make it so difficult on them that they have to quit or they give up. All right? See, remember that was the Julian the Apostate, what he did and other kinds of things. So Louis learns a lesson from history and goes, okay, well, I'm not going to go persecute you directly, but I'm going to make your life so stinking miserable that you're going to give in to me. And so he proceeds on by excluding Protestants from office. Okay? Constrains meetings of synods. Closes churches outside of stipulated areas where they can meet. He bans Protestant outdoor preachers. He prohibits domestic Protestant migration. So basically, you are not allowed to, as a Protestant, to move from a Catholic-ruled area to a Protestant area. So what do you have to do because you can't move? You've got to convert to be a Catholic because you're not allowed to be a Protestant because the ruler of that region says, we're Catholic here. And now you can't move because remember in Switzerland, what were they doing? The Protestants could go to Protestant areas and the Catholics go to Catholic areas. Well, Louis says, no more of that. Not in France.
So did people just leave France? Is that what they ended up doing?
Well, you're gonna see. What would you do, Catherine? You'd leave France?
Yeah.
Good, because lots of them do. That's exactly what happens. But not yet, because a lot of people can put up with that stuff. They didn't rebel at this point, okay? He's made it odious to them. He's made it difficult on them, but they haven't rebelled yet. So in 1681, Louis bans Protestants' right to immigrate, which makes it worse. He commands Protestants to house French soldiers, though, which was in his right under the law, but he exempts Catholics. And so these were referred to as the dragonnades. And that, of course, how would you like to have to put up a bunch of soldiers in your house on you? Yeah, this was actually one of the complaints that happened during the Revolutionary War. One of the colonists was like, wait a second, you're making us put up soldiers from our own country that you're putting here to control us and you're making us pay for it? Right? As you notice, the American colonies were not particularly thrilled with those things. Neither were the Protestants in France. Because only the Protestants had to do it. The Catholics didn't. This made things really, really hard. So by 1865, so many Protestants had converted. What's that? 1685, not 1865. I'm very dyslexic with numbers. 1685. The Huguenots, many of them converted. Louis decided, you don't need any more protection, so I'm going to repeal that Edict of Nantes. So you don't need any more protection. And so he establishes the Edict of Fontainebleau, I think that's how it's pronounced, which makes it illegal to be a Protestant in France. And this basically allowing of exiling of Protestant pastors, demolishing of churches, instituting forced baptisms, banning Protestant groups. It ushers in renewed expansion of persecutions. And some scholars estimate between 200 and 900,000 Huguenots fled France, taking with them all those valuable skills and tradesmen and all the other stuff. So they go to England, they go to the Netherlands, they go to Switzerland, the Brandenburg Prussia, Denmark, Holy Roman Empire, South Africa, and North America. By the way, as a little historic note, John Jay and Paul Revere were of Huguenot descent. So some of the founding fathers and people in the American Revolution were from some of the Huguenots who went. In 1686, Louis himself claimed that out of the Huguenot population of 800,000 to 900,000, only 1,000 to 1,500 remained in France. So, yeah, this is why you start hearing about the church in the desert, because what happens? Everybody's against you, so they go underground. Because now nobody is backing you, and there's so many people left. You basically went from a church of nearly 1 million people to a church of a few thousand people, at least that anybody could see. The thing about it is there are a lot of them that converted outwardly, but inwardly said, nope. And so they went ahead and practiced privately. They said, yeah, I'm a Catholic, and no, I'm a Protestant. They never really did. And some of the people that still stood strong against this are referred to as the Camisards. And they were heroes of Protestantism for years because they sort of hung out in the mountains of south central France and fought the French, the rest of the French, because they said, we're still Protestant here. Now, Louis is going to die in 1715. And of course, we have more Louis, because of course, you've got the 13th, the 14th. And we're going to get them to the 15th and the 16th. By the way, Louis the 14th outlived his son and grandson. Whoa. It was his great-grandson who becomes the next Louis. Wow. So 72 years, he outlived both his son and grandson. That tells you something. Whoa. So by this time, the Protestants, this is 17, we're moving to 1724 time period, that there's a new decree prohibiting secret exercise of Reformed religion. So in other words, before it was not illegal to practice, you just weren't supposed to, but now it becomes illegal to practice. All right? So this is just one more step. And these guys, there was a guy named Anton Court who becomes significant in the movement of the underground church, that church in the desert type of idea. He was born in 1696. His parents were peasants persecuted under Louis XIV. He begins to speak at secret meetings and establishes a renewed movement. Now, here's some of the things that they put forth from a theologic or practice perspective. Regular religious meetings for teaching and worship. Okay, because remember, a lot of churches, it would just still rote ritual. He says, nope, you need to get together for teaching and worship. Suppression of fanaticism for those who profess to be inspired. In other words, how much trouble had been caused by, God gave me a vision, let's, go take this town type of thing. He basically said, you guys, no. None of this fanaticism stuff. We're sticking to the Bible, what it says, what it does. None of this, God showed me this revelation thing. So he was very strong against that. Restoration of discipline by establishing consistories, conferences, and synods. In other words, he's building that more Presbyterian Calvinistic type of structure. And careful training of pastors. He said, just like Calvin did in Geneva, he's doing the same thing in France, or trying to. In 1715, Court is recognized as the first synod in French Reformed Church. he continues to say, hey, things should be done according to the Scriptures in all matters of church and state. He says, but when there's a law that doesn't prohibit you to do as a Christian what the Bible would teach you, submit to it. And even if a Protestant pastor is arrested, don't rebel. The state has that right. It's not, you don't have the right to rebel against it. And in 1730, a price was put on his head and causes him to flee to, I think it's Lausanne, Switzerland, where he establishes, a seminary. And he spends the rest of his life till he dies in 1767 teaching and training pastors to go back in and basically be missionary underground church guys in France. Now, if you notice here, we're 1767. Just reverse 2 digits, be dyslexic on the last. You got 1776. So where are we moving into? We're moving into that time frame by the time this guy's here of near the American Revolution, which of course is going to have a major effect on the next workings of good old Louis the 16th and his wife Marie and Antoinette and all the other fun stuff that's going to come out of that. So this persecution that was going on continues until 1787, when Louis XVI finally declares religious tolerance. However, all these persecutions have disillusioned much of French society. So religion seems to have only caused strife, difficulty, etc. Because remember, everything's wrapped in God told me this and we should do that, that kind of stuff. I have the divine right? For all these years, everything's been wrapped in religion. So by this time, the people in France are kind of like, I am sick and tired of religion because it doesn't do anything. Now, they completely missed the point because most all of this was all politics. That does not mean there was not religion that had part of it and people's zeal, but it should teach us a lesson of being really careful about what we're really about. We're about sharing the gospel, not about overthrowing governments, right? So the French people said, well, I'm going to turn to reason, and guys like Voltaire and other people like that, and we're going to get the complete French Revolution, which is going to be a completely secular revolution here shortly because, again, Louis XVI, 1787, we see that this whole thing with the church in France eventually, through all the machinations and all of the politics and all of the religious battle, ends up leading to a French Revolution, which becomes very non-religious. That's why eventually Napoleon crowns himself emperor. Pope no longer does that. So, after the French Revolution, of course, but it's quite amazing what happens. Now, let's turn ourselves to England. No problem. English history in 20 minutes. The Puritans. Now, a lot of the Puritan movement really comes out of a distaste for the Anglican only moving a few steps away from Catholicism. They basically took a lot of the 39 articles that were the basis of stuff that good old Melanchthon had written out of the Peace of Augsburg and the Augsburg Confession and all that kind of stuff that was adopted by Henry VIII, which became the 39 Articles, and you had the Common Book of Prayer and all that kind of stuff. Well, most of these guys are saying, well, wait a second, all this stuff is just kind of repurposed Catholicism, Catholic light. We really think it should go further. Let's continue on. We've done good here, now let's continue on. Well, if you're the head of the church, by the way, the king or the queen, Elizabeth or whoever follows on, what are you going to want? Hey, I'm the head of the church. I want peace. Stop messing with things. The Puritans, though, saw so much corruption that they kind of went further and further and further afield into the everything's got to be exactly perfect. Okay? This is that, remember we talked about actions and reactions? The other thing that you have to realize is a lot of the Puritans, we always think, they were the Puritans. Well, no, they were a group of people that were under the category of Puritan. And they had a whole bunch of different ways they thought about stuff. Matter of fact, they fought amongst themselves more than they fought with the Anglicans and Catholics until it became war, and then they joined together until it was done, and then they started fighting again. So don't think the Puritans were some group of homogeneous beliefs and practices. They weren't. Some really good stuff they did, some really not so good stuff they did. And they get involved in English politics tremendously. But I want to focus more on the things that, from a religious perspective, even though I'm going to have to touch on a few things from a political perspective. Now, here are some of the things in 1563. We just moved back 200 years. 1563, that at the first convocation of English clergy, this Puritan faction, again, said, hey, we need to change some more things. We need to reduce the number of saints' days. We need to eliminate vestments. We need to eliminate kneeling at communion. We need to eliminate emergency baptisms for sickly newborns. We need to eliminate organs from churches. Evil organs. And when you get some, remember this is the time where you still have a lot of Catholic rebellion leaders. More and more people become more and more favorable towards Protestantism, and therefore the Puritans get more and more foothold. So again, they start growing. They're not the main group, but they start growing. And they continue to not particularly like what happens in the Anglican Church, because it takes away from teaching and preaching per se. They want, look, if you're going to know the Bible, you need to be taught the Bible. Remember, we've just gotten through in the early 1500s, we've just gotten that you have an English Bible and it's translated, it's put in the church, you have the Geneva Bible, you have all this stuff. They said, well, you need to be educated, you need to be trained, you need to be taught. Well, if you're following a liturgy through the Common Book of Prayer, how much leeway do you have on learning anything besides in that one book? And that's not the Bible. Not a lot. So they start pressing further and further and further to say, no, we need to be focusing more on preaching and teaching, which is a good thing because you want people trained. And good old John Foxe, I think this is the John Foxe of Foxe's Book of Martyrs. I forget, but I think it is. He wanted some deviation to allow the conscience of the clergyman to be put forth. The other thing is some of the Puritans start discussing profitable questions, which end up being far more acrimonious than profitable, in particular Sabbatarianism. Now, a lot of people think, oh, Luther and Calvin and all were Sabbatarians. No, they weren't. We have evidence that they weren't. They said, no, just like, yes, that's a custom, that's a practice. Puritans, Sabbatarianism. This is where you drag a lot of the Old Testamental stuff into the New, and you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't do this. You got to look like Israel, so the Sabbath and all that kind of stuff, except it wasn't Sabbatarianism because they were first day, not seventh day, which is kind of interesting. So it's like, we'll waffle on that one. But they begin to press the Sabbatarian idea. Now, part of the reason they did that, for good reason, is people were doing anything and everything on Sundays, and they're supposed to be in church, and they were rowdy and cockfights and horse racing and gambling and, if you will, it was pretty bad. So, of course, what were they trying to do is they're trying to sort of straighten up society a little bit and organize it. And remember, these are in the days where church and state still are so intermixed that you can't tell one from the other. And if church and state, one, you regulate through the state, well, what do you want? You want your church's views regulated through the state, which is what they want to try to do. And they start developing power in Parliament. Now, I am not going to go through all of the wonderful things that go along with Parliament, but just understand the English tradition of limiting king's powers and the growth of the nobles, clergy, and commoners goes way back to Prince John, the Magna Carta, 1215. So if you notice here, they've got several hundred years on France. That's why the French kings are able to stomp down the nobles, because the nobles aren't really interested in a parliamentary system particularly. In England, though, they were slowly developing concessions and rights and things like that. And over this time period, we're going to see they are going to develop this into something far more modern looking. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of, as they say, who shot John type of thing, because there's just too much detail here. So I'm just going to pull out a few of the key ideas that we see with all of the parliamentary stuff and Cromwell and things like that. First off, again, I mentioned that the Puritans wanted the right to preach. Now, during Elizabeth's reign, under that religious settlement, less than 10% of the 40,000 English parish clergy were licensed to preach. So we always think, well, if they were a priest or a parish priest or a parish pastor, they were allowed to preach. No. 10% were allowed to preach. So what's the rest of your day? You certainly aren't preparing sermons. You're not teaching Sunday school lessons. You're not doing anything. You're tending the poor and taking care of things and doing your rituals and whatever. 10%. So that's a mindset that for us, we think, of course, every Sunday somebody gets up there and preaches. Nah. 10% of the parishes had people who could preach or were authorized by law to preach. And the reason is, of course, they wanted you to follow the standard common book of prayer. They wanted you to follow the liturgy. They wanted you to follow all these different things. And also, if you could get up there and preach, what would happen? You might influence your parish. Why do you think we have laws about nonprofits and political involvement from places like churches? Because these type of ideas of you get too much politics and religion mixed together, what do you end up with? Little hotbeds for political overthrow. That's why we have that separation idea in our country, because we're not interested in that. Guys, if you notice, the Founding Fathers learned a lot from history about things that they went through, about stuff that they saw, and why they put a lot of the stuff in place because of this problem. Unfortunately, we're looking more like France now because, now it's so secularized, it's now don't have any religion, which is not what the original structure of our government was set up to be. Now, we have some of the bishops and wealthy laymen who wanted this preaching to be done because they were supporting education of the pastors, if you will. If you want a pastor, you want him educated, so you need to let him preach and teach. Now, James I, who happens to be king particularly now, opposed traditional elements of the English church worship, and because they were largely Catholic in origin, they didn't like this during this time. They wanted a sober life. This is the Puritans, under James. They wanted a sober life guided by Scripture, lacking in luxury or ostentationness, if you will. Insisted on the observation of the Sabbath, devoted exclusively to religious exercises and acts of charity. So if you notice here, that's that Sabbatarian idea. They weren't opposed to alcohol, but they were really critical of drunkenness, particularly amongst church leaders. This, of course, then spills over to other things where you might consume alcohol. And where might you do that? Drinking, gambling, smoking, cockfights, horse races, whatever. Dancing, right? Cards, dancing, alcohol, tobacco. Sound familiar? They were against all this stuff. And they didn't particularly care for the structure of the episcopal structure of the church. And there were a bunch of different groups, some that liked the Presbyterian model, and other people who were more Congregationalists, which will later become Congregationalists. At this particular time, they are independents. And then there's other ones that were like, no, we understand an elder rule, but it's an independent church, not under a hierarchy. So you have everywhere from super hierarchy to sort of hierarchy to kind of hierarchy to no hierarchy. And you got all different flavors. And of course, everybody can defend that from the Bible, because we know the second chapter of ecclesiology of Paul's books said, here's how a church has to be organized, right? That is such an interesting topic when you have to teach it, because everybody's got their own view of why you should or shouldn't do it. Because it's all democratic here in the U.S., right? Because we're a democracy, and that's how church runs. Not necessarily. Now, I am not going to go into the English Parliament, because that is like 5 pages of notes that are just a nightmare. What we're going to see, though, is we're going to see James the First. What's one of the famous things that we all know that James the First is famous for? King James Bible, yeah. Yeah, so he was the guy who commissions the King James Bible. He is a guy who people don't like particularly, and some people weren't crazy about him. Some people thought he was maybe a homosexual. They said Elizabeth was king, now James is queen. That was their expression of their king at the particular time. They weren't real pleased with this dude. Because he pretty much was kind of frivolous, kind of, as I guess what we would call it, a dandy, a fop, whatever not manly, strong kind of guy. He favored his friends. He was, wasn't bad with money from a perspective of being corrupt, but he was certainly not financially responsible. He'd spend money on projects that were his pet projects, and it's like, hey, I want to build a tower over here, and there's a bridge that's got to get across the Thames River here. It's falling down. London Bridge is falling down. Well, James was a guy who would say, I like my tower and my castle out here, and who cares about the bridge? He's not real wise in the way he spent stuff. I don't know. No, I don't think it was at that time. London Bridge is falling down comes a little bit later, if my memory serves me. Or maybe it was earlier. I can't remember. But it did come from disrepair of London Bridge. The idea, though, he made peace with Spain. So he did that. He expanded English trade. You got the East India Company going around the world, including Japan and Indonesia. He colonizes America. Hey, 1607. Oh, Jamestown. Wonder why it was called that. And then later on, 1620, the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Plymouth, which wasn't where it was supposed to be. He wants to merge English and Scottish practices in government and everything like that. Not a good idea. Scots aren't real crazy about that thought. And the Scottish Presbyterians are really not crazy about that thought. The only one group that is still consistently persecuted is who? No, the Puritans are the ones that are doing persecuting. Who's the one group everybody hated? Anabaptists. Yeah, there you go. Everybody still hates the Anabaptists. So if you were an Anabaptist, it didn't matter where you were in trouble. So the Anabaptists were the one group that was still persecuted, which is kind of interesting. Because, of course, they had these egalitarian ideas, which threatens the king's power, right? Hey, we're equal, we're brothers, Sorry, that didn't go over with the divine right of kings. There are all sorts of other things that are going on. But the last execution for heresy in England was a Bartholomew legate. And he talked with King James, and he said he hadn't prayed in 7 years. So James was so appalled that he had him burned at the stake with a guy named Edward Whiteman. And so those were the last executions in England for heresy. You hadn't prayed in 7 years. We're going to burn you at the stake. That's pretty scary. But that's it. That's the end. Now, that didn't say there isn't political persecution, but those are the last burning at the stakes or executions for heresy in England during King James' rule. Now, there's fighting back and forth. There's all sorts of other stuff that goes on. You got Guy Fawkes Day, Catholic tried to blow up Parliament and all that kind of stuff. Then after you get rid of James, you get a really unpopular guy, Charles I. And he has this idea of divine right of kings. He supports all sorts of issues. His statement is, the kings are not bound to give their account of their actions, but to God alone. I think this is going to go over well, because what's he trying to emulate? The same ideas of the French kings. This is where the Scottish and English kings were trying to have that same power that the French kings had, but they did not have the political backing that the French kings did. They also didn't have Cardinal Richelieu. Charles also supports a controversial cleric guy named Richard Montague. And he said, hey, the Anglican Church Episcopacy is the model of the early church, and therefore all other branches or forms of government should be designed as unlawful. Wonder how the Puritans thought about that one. Not too much. He supports the divine right of kings, of course, because who is the head of the church? The king. So the king and the church, and then they have power and they have complete control. So he supports that. And again, they don't like it. They don't like the idea of predestination. And so he supports Arminian doctrine and Roman Catholic doctrines. Things don't go so well. So that therefore, of course, makes Charles, that he's a guy he supports, wondering about where Charles really is. So now the Puritans are going, I don't like Charles, right? If you notice, it's bouncing back and forth. And of course, you got the 30-Year Wars in there. Toss that in. By 1633, you have a guy named William Laud, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he puts all sorts of unpopular reforms in to ensure religious uniformity. And he, of course, dismisses nonconformists and closes Puritan organizations. He insists that the Church of England comply with the liturgy established by the Common Book of Prayer, desires to change the architecture of churches to emphasize the altar. Does this sound anything the Puritans would like? No. Laud persecutes nonconformists using two primary laws, the Court of High Commission and the Court of Star Chamber. Both really bad. I'm not even going to go to it, and you read in the notes. Many of the people go, I am sick and tired of this. We're going to Massachusetts. And so a lot of Puritans, nonconformists, come to America. Gee, I wonder if we have that rebel spirit at our heart. That's where we come from. So we got Huguenots who are persecuted. We have Puritans who are nonconformists who are persecuted. And of course, we come over here and just persecute each other. So don't worry, American history is no better. They Charles tries to enforce uniformity on Scotland, rewriting the Scottish Book of Prayer and other things. Bad, bad, bad. You end up with riots in 1637. You get the Scots rebelling against the king. You get the English Protestants, Puritans, and the Scottish Presbyterians now joining forces against the king because neither of them like him, even though they don't necessarily get along either. Anybody want to live in England at this particular time? It's going back and forth. There are more wars, there are more fighting, there's more persecution, there's more changing of sides than you can possibly shake a stick at, as they say in the South. And so Scotland, and of course Ireland gets involved too, because the Irish can't be left alone. You know, they're going to get into a war too. So they're fighting, and everybody's switching sides back and forth between Ireland, Scotland, England, who's supporting the king, who's not supporting the king, who's supporting... It gets bad. And then it gets worse. And eventually you end up with an English Civil War after the king tries to force Parliament and he attacks Parliament. That had never happened before. And needless to say, the people were not crazy about it. So you get to the English Civil War. And at the English Civil War, this is where you get the good old royalists against the Roundheads. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the English Civil War. But during this whole period of time, there is something of significance. Of course, Cromwell's rise to power through the war. But while everybody's fighting with each other and going back and forth and putting kings in prison and all this other kind of mess, you end up with a thing in 1643, the Westminster Assembly. And this is where Parliament commissions, okay, all of you guys get together and try to do things to confer and treat among themselves such as discipline and government that may be most agreeable to God's holy word and most apt to procure and preserve the peace of the church at home and the nearer agreement with the Church of Scotland and the Reformed churches abroad. That was their task. And so basically they spend 4 years and meet over 1,000 times, and they end up producing the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Westminster Larger Catechism, the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and the Directory of Public Worship. We're familiar with most of that. And so basically this is something that the Scottish Church and a lot of the, not all, but a lot of the Puritans and some of the more moderate Episcopalian Anglicans could agree to. So this is a very, very reformed, if you will, set of doctrines, catechisms, etc. So out of all this fighting, they actually did try, yay, the Bible, let's go see what it says. I really get tired of teaching this, and this guy killed this guy because this one hated that person. It's like, look, there's actually something biblical produced out of this. So God does know what he's doing, but man, what a nightmare to have to go through. Now, eventually, you end up with chaos in England. The king is defeated, he's captured, he goes over to the Scots, they turn him over to Parliament. Parliament and the army start fighting with each other because the Parliament is more Presbyterian-ish, and the army thinks they're the representative of the people, so they make demands, and Parliament tries to dissolve them. Parliament doesn't dissolve them because they keep fighting. Nightmare. Enter Oliver Cromwell, a guy who is converted, is very religiously zealous, is a very good leader, military commander, and says, I want nothing to do with being king. So I will set up and I will act as Lord and protector until we can figure out to get a constitution established to run this country. He meets with limited success in that, but at least he is somebody they can look to. And eventually Cromwell dies. And they leave the Lord Protectorate to his son, Richard. I think it's his third son. Richard does not do so well. Matter of fact, Richard gets really frustrated with it really fast and resigns in less than a year. And everybody says, okay, now what do we do? Let's go get another king. So they go back and get Charles II. He lasts about 3 years because he's not real good. You end up with, or a short time, then you end up with a James. No, is it James? Yeah, James II. And they don't like him. He lasts 3 years. And then they rebel, and the English say, all right, out with you Jameses, out with you Charles. We're going to try a William and a Mary. So you get William and Mary, who are actually more Dutch-German, who then come and become king and queen of England. And you get, College of William and Mary. And they actually did a pretty good job, though they didn't actually speak English because they were from a German background. But they were related, so you end up with that. Now, forgive me for going through all this stuff so fast. But there is so much material here. Please read the notes. It's really good material, but I think you're getting the picture. The English church and the way it operates and all the things are very different than what happens in France and other parts of the world. That's why we have much more affinity in understanding English stuff when most of us come from that background, at least to begin with. The country's foundations anyway. And you see where all these people were coming from and why they ended up being either forced out or left and ended up in the United States. Or at the time, the colonies. But there was French, there was Spanish, there were Dutch, there were English, there were all sorts of folks. But most of the people were people who had different views theologically and governmentally that came to the U.S. So it has all of these things have a tremendous impact on all of that stuff.